So thank you, everybody, and welcome to our session on impact and measurement. I think across society, and certainly in arenas like this, we're really fortunate that acceptance that implementing a mental health programme is the right thing to do for your people. But increasingly, it's becoming important that we also look to try and measure what we're doing around mental health and well-being. Not just because we want to make sure that we're actually doing the right thing for our people, but also inevitably there are competing priorities for finance and programmes, and even within the well-being space. We know that measuring behaviour change is really challenging, but that's not a reason not to do it. And we're very fortunate today to be joined by 4 panellists, all from very different organisations running a variety of wellbeing and mental health programmes, and they're going to talk about how they have addressed the challenge of measurement, some of the results, and some things that we can all take away to use within our own organisations. So just in terms of introductions across the panel, we've got Claire Hallmey. Claire's the Health and Wellbeing Manager at Oracle, with responsibility for the Wellbeing programme. Oracle have got 5,000 people in the UK, 30,000 across Europe. It's a very diverse and large population, lots of home workers, workers across international markets, and it was really important that the programme that was run at Oracle met the needs of this diverse group of people. We've then got Gina Wills. Gina is the Leadership and Learning Manager at Central England Co-op. It's one of the largest independent retailers in the UK. Again, a very diverse business, 400 trading outlets, from food retailing to travel to funeral services. The Central England Co-op signed the Time to Change pledge in 2016, and since then have had a rolling initiative around mental health, which has included awareness and line manager activity. Next is Pip. Pip's Head of Employee Relations at Brakes, responsible for their wellbeing programme. Brakes is a Cisco company, one of the leading food wholesalers in the UK, distributing food, drink, other services from 30 distribution centres across the UK. Again, Brakes signed the Time to Change pledge in 2018 and have been running a programme since then. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. And last but of course not least, Claire Gillis. Claire's the International Chief Executive of WPP Health Practice, responsible for 1,000 people across 10 countries, and has done a lot of very progressive work around wellbeing, including putting a wellness lab within the London office. So we'll move straight on to the questions. My first question is for Claire. Oracle are a very data-driven organisation, and that philosophy, of course, lends itself to all of the programmes that you run, including wellbeing. Can you explain a little bit about how Oracle have addressed the challenge of measuring wellbeing, what you've measured and why?
Yeah, sure. So it is a data company, so it seemed relevant that we focused on some data in terms of health and wellbeing. And we used the data for sort of 2 things. I think initially we were really conscious that if we wanted to have any investment from our leadership team, that we needed to be proving the worth of the programme and showing them that actually they were getting some kind of return on investment. But also it's been really interesting because it's helped us scope our programme. So the more data we know about our population, the sort of longer term health risks and the shorter term sort of health risks, health behaviours of our employees, then that can really help to scope our programme. But in terms of measurement, we sort of started initially by just literally putting a marker in the sand. We sort of, everything's quite vast when you look at what you can measure, and it's really difficult to sort of start almost. So we literally sort of looked at all the reports that we had from all of our different providers, from occupational health, from income protection, critical illness, employee assistance programme, and we just sort of took a marker in the sand and said, right, okay, this is the position of occupational health at the moment. We measured it as we introduced the programme. We looked at the impact of that. And that was kind of our starting point, really, really simple to take it initially. And then from there, we've looked at measuring sickness absence data. And that has been quite a manual internal process that we've added on. It's not something that's been, super automated, and it has kind of grown organically over the years. But we've put a marker in the sand each month, and now we've got some data for that. And then we also have a partner forum with all of our providers where we have a quarterly data dashboard from that, where we look at what the trends are. So it started off simply, and we've got fancier as we've kind of learnt and gone along the ways.
Fabulous, thank you. Next, move on to Gina. Co-op are a very people-driven organisation. Can you explain why it was important for you to measure results of your mental health and wellbeing activity?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess once you set out on that journey, the measurement is, you've already got the investment. So like the kind of explanation we heard this morning about the importance of leadership, we definitely had that conversation right from the start of our journey. So it was almost just a great way to continue the conversation, and we had that definite drive to understand, yes, what was working and how we were getting good returns on what we were doing, but also what we would do next. So for us, it was as much about evolution. So if I think about where we were at the start of our journey, when we first started talking about mental health in the workplace, to where we are today, it's different. So the needs have evolved. We've had to keep adjusting and changing as we've gone to get the best kind of results. And certainly it was about that continuous improvement approach, always looking for different ways and getting, a little bit like you said, that kind of input back to go, what else would help? Kind of let's listen through the evaluation process and understand what else would help our colleagues in the workplace.
Great, thank you. And then moving on to Pip. Breaks is a very challenging environment, just the nature of the business. Very male workforce, shift workers, relatively high turnover as part of the industry. What outcomes were you looking for from a programme?
Yeah, so when we started to look at the programme, I think we were really conscious of what is it we are trying to do. We didn't just want to jump on a bandwagon and be doing a mental health wellbeing programme because everybody else was, so it must be important. So working with Mental Health Foundation, we worked to really set quite a simple goal, which was to promote and support positive mental health for all of our colleagues. And we did that really through looking at 3 key areas. So we started our campaign really driving awareness, because there's an assumption that everybody knows actually what mental health wellbeing is and what good looks like. So we started with an awareness campaign, and then we built on that with actual education, so helping our line managers and colleagues understand what good mental health looked like. And then finally, we wanted to provide practical tools, so not just talk about it, not just do the campaigns, not just educate, but actually physically give our colleagues something that would make a difference in their day-to-day lives.
Thank you. And Claire, WPP Health Practice are a very technology-driven organisation, and I know that you've got a number of initiatives in place around wellbeing. Measuring the impact's obviously key for you. Can you tell us about why and where you started?
So we started because health is part of our business, our clients, and if you don't have, if you're not bringing your best self to work, then how can you do brilliant work for clients? So, and as you said, we are, I hope, a technology-driven environment. So there was an opportunity to put in place an initiative with BioBeats. And it was part, you mentioned our wellness lab. So across our organisation, we have a number of initiatives, including in-house counselling, yoga, all of these things we were doing, and we knew it was the right thing to do, but we wanted to be able to measure the impact of that. So BioBeats is a way of gathering real-world evidence at scale, so that each of our employees, and we've got initiatives over London, Sydney, and Milan, each of our employees can understand their responses to the environment around them and then do something about it. And we see that aggregated data because we don't want to see people's personal data. That's very important to us. We see aggregated data, and then we can decide what our next initiatives should be. So it's a very tangible way of empowering employees whilst giving us the information to say, actually, we had that intervention and that worked really well, or that didn't work so well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move back to you next, Gina. You're using a version of the Kirkpatrick model to measure and evaluate learning around mental health programmes. Can you explain to us a little bit about this and what you've measured?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of our kind of approach, we've rolled out a programme to all line managers in the business, and we're about halfway through reaching all of them at the moment. That programme, we've worked with the Mental Health Foundation to kind of establish how we'd evaluate it really effectively. So what we've done is looked at it in a really rounded way. So have the learners had a good experience on the programme? So, you know, did they get everything they felt they needed? Did they enjoy it? What were their responses? Equally, then did they learn what they needed to learn? So we've done some work around kind of taking track of where they were on their journey before and then after the programme, so that we get a sense of did they actually learn those skills they needed, and then certainly how they've transferred that back, so that all important, I've learned something, but am I actually able to go back into the workplace and do something a bit different? So we've looked at that kind of transition back. Are there any obstacles? What would help them if they're not? Those sorts of themes. And then last but not least, more organisationally, how those activities, the line manager programme and other initiatives we've run, have impacted some results in terms of things like colleague survey, absence, all sorts of different bits and pieces there. So a nice rounded approach.
Great, thank you. Pip, the programme that you ran at Breaks did have was in two phases. It was partly about how do you help line managers understand and manage their own mental health, and then there was also some scenario-based skills training alongside a programme of employee-wide initiatives. Can you just give us a brief overview of what you measured and some of the evaluation methods that you chose to use?
Yeah, absolutely. So as some of the other speakers have said, we started with the data that we did have. So we looked at both sickness absence data, we looked at the usage of our employee assistance programme, helpline, we looked at the number of absence days that we'd had within the business. So we started with what we already had in terms of measurement. But we were very conscious that we did want to look at our return on investment, but actually for us, it was more about our value on investment and understanding whether we'd made that real cultural shift. So in a very male-dominated workforce, where the first response sometimes to talk about mental health was, that's for somebody else to talk about, not me. We really want to be able to measure that shift in culture and that organisational change. So we did that through looking at things like our employee survey. When we ran our line manager workshops, we looked at a questionnaire before the workshop to understand their current attitude towards mental health. We did another survey directly after the workshop, and then we followed that up 6 months later to really understand whether we had made that organisational shift. And we used other things such as feedback on our internal Facebook page and also comments captured from some of the events we ran. We had an infamous curry and chat event, which we held across all of our centres, which appealed to a lot of our population, and from our tea and talk sessions as well. So it's really about combining both ROI and VOI to really understand what's happening in your organisation.
And I think it's important that when we look at what's happening as this discipline evolves, we have to be careful what we measure, because the natural next step is targeting towards what we think is the best outcome. And of course, we know that if we target things, our human behaviour drives us towards those endpoints, and they may not necessarily be the right endpoints. Look at hospital waiting times, for example. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is a scientific approach that looks at all of the metrics to be able to drive the best behaviours. And I think we're in our infancy at the moment with looking at it.
Absolutely.
But it requires more studies and more dialogue.
Yeah, No, quite. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about, for your technology-based approach, what have you measured, and how do you see that being useful across your organisation?
So for BioBeats, we only launched it on World Mental Health Day in October, so we don't have, valid data yet to look at. Our other initiatives, we have subjective feedback, so there aren't enough slots, for example, for our in-house counselling. That's not to say that we have a toxic environment. We absolutely don't. Because the things that people are coming to him about are not workplace challenges. It's about life challenges. And sometimes what people need is an outlet. So, and our well-being sessions are oversubscribed, and it feels like a great place to be. The buzz is fantastic, but of course, putting in the BioBeats initiative, for example, is a way of looking and creating data that we can interrogate at a scalable level.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire, I'd like to move on to you next. Could you highlight any of the headline results that you've had so far, and maybe explain a little about how you've used them to evolve your wellbeing programme?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've managed to, in terms of, going back to the days where I said, we looked at our occupational health data, we've managed to actually completely revolutionise how we use our occupational health service. So we saw some really dramatic results in how we were using occupational health. And in terms of measurement and money and lost time only, over the course of about 3 years, we managed to save about £2 million in lost time only. So that was kind of the icing on the cake behind the lost time only, were lots of other, implications, recruitment costs and all of those sorts of things as well. And we've seen in total sickness absence percentages come down, and we've seen an impact in mental health, sickness absence come down as well. And that's in longer and medium term, because actually sometimes we do see a fluctuation in shorter term, which we don't necessarily consider a negative thing. We see that more as a positive thing, in that people are getting more help for their challenges in the moment when they need them, rather than 6 months later. But in terms of how we've used that to structure the programme going forwards, we've actually, we introduced a service for line managers. So around the time when lots of people were talking about line manager training for mental health particularly, we've got, as you mentioned before, we've got a really vast population. So we've got about 5,000 people in the UK. We've got about 30,000 people across 63 countries in EMEA. And then we've got global teams and things as well. And actually, we've got 21% of our population who are based in the UK but could be managed, who work from home and could be managed through globally. So they might, physically they're in the UK, but they've got no management lines to any of those sort of structures. So what we have done for them is introduce a service we call Swift. It's basically a line manager support line. So the line manager, if an employee comes to them, can then contact the support line. It's run by our income protection provider. They have access to all of the different Oracle benefits, and they can then signpost them to what might be the most relevant and most appropriate solution for that employee. And that's worked really well for us, and it's moved organically in terms of how we look at the data. And then from that, the stuff that we're learning from Swift and the types of challenges that managers have, we did a session on having mentally healthy conversations, because we realised that was one of the challenges of line managers across the board was that. So it's really kind of evolved in terms of what we're learning and what we're doing year on year in terms of mental health specifically.
So very much a people-driven strategy as you evolve.
Yes, definitely.
Fabulous. Gina, let's move on to you. As part of your evaluation process, I know that you've collected quite a lot of quantitative data. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that was, and then any challenges or surprises within that?
Okie dokie. So certainly we have gathered lots of information about how learners entered into the programme, so that kind of course position in terms of attitude towards mental health, like you described, and their level of comfort and awareness, how willing they'd be to share their own stories if they were experiencing challenges. So to get a real understanding of both abilities and skills, to manage it in the workplace, but also that kind of attitude to mental health as well. How's that shifting with a view to it being a long journey.
Yes.
And wanting to see that longer term change. We've collected lots of information around the sort of absence rates within the organisation, and we've seen some surprises initially. Certainly, when we first started the programme, we did see an increase in kind of mental health related absence. I can remember having a conversation with one manager who sort of questioned me a little bit about that and said, is this right? But actually, the more organisations I talk to, it's quite a common story, I think. So I think that's a great example of that kind of not setting your targets or being very careful about how you set your targets, because it's a journey and it's about looking at the data but then digging a little bit deeper to understand what it's really telling you. So that's been really, really helpful. Our colleagues we've had around a 30% kind of increase in the number of colleagues that felt really, really confident and comfortable with understanding mental health related illnesses and that awareness piece. And in terms of the kind of Be Heard survey, we refer to our colleague survey, that's shown some really interesting strides in certain parts of the business. So that's definitely driving our next steps, because it's that kind of, okay, why is that part of the business seen such a big jump in terms of how colleagues think we're positively supporting them, and how can we mirror it? So what can we learn from them and take that out elsewhere? So.
Great, thank you. Claire, could you talk a little bit about how you plan to use this data to inform the next iteration of your mental wellbeing programme?
Well, because we don't know where it's going to land, I can't talk about the initiatives. I think because we don't know what they're going to be yet. I know that for our industry, we are a creative transformation company. Our employee population is a third more likely as a creative to suffer from mental health issues than a non-creative population. So we have to do something, and it has to be appropriate for that particular employee cohort. I think what's important is that we carry on with the dialogue, because 3 years ago we never would have had a conference like this, and now look at the contributors and people sitting in the audience, very different companies and big companies. So there is an appetite for doing something. It's just making sure we don't jump in too quickly. And it's sustainable. This shouldn't be just lip service. For us, it's about measuring. It's about understanding the implications of that. And I guess as a communications company, it's about talking about it, because we need the best talent to come through our doors. And increasingly, talent will go to where employers are offering the best environment.
Yeah. Yes. No, thank you. Great. Pip.
Yeah.
Taking a kind of little bit of a different tack from the data-driven approaches to measurements, I know that you've done quite a bit of work around the power of stories. So perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about how you've balanced that against hard metrics and the value of having both sets of measurement.
Yeah, of course. So I think hard metrics are important, because when you're going to get investment from the executive teams, they want to see some of those metrics. But actually, for us, some of the most powerful data and measurement we've done is around particularly the information coming through on our Facebook stories. So the day that we signed our Time to Change pledge, our internal Facebook lit up with colleague stories, and within an hour we had over 100 stories of colleagues sharing their very personal experiences to some extent, and it was story after story after story, which gave us that confirmation that our organisation was crying out for this wellbeing programme. But it also started something more. It started a community, because not only were people sharing, but people were offering their help to each other and building that network across what is a multi-site organisation. So the power of having that ability to share with each other has been really important. It enables us to read the different stories, to understand what's happening very quickly within our organisation. And on occasions, it has enabled us to intervene. So as a result of some of the line managers' training, where they've seen cries for help that might have gone ignored beforehand, they've been able to recognise when someone's put certain comments on Facebook that that person needs help very quickly, and they've been able to mobilise themselves very fast to get that colleague to local crisis mental health team or working with our mental health first aiders. So absolutely the metrics, hard metrics are important, but you need to listen to what your organisation is telling you through whether it's social media, whether it's through your surveys or just in employee forums. However you look at that, that's what really gives you the measurement of how your organisation is responding to your mental health wellbeing programme.
Yeah, quite. Gina, I know that you've also done some work around qualitative measurement to try and understand behavioural change. Could you explain a little bit about how you've done that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done lots of focus groups with learners to understand a bit more of that detail. So not just statistically, what are they saying, but what stories are they telling us about their experience and what they've done and how can that inform. So we've pulled themes out from that to work together with Mental Health at Work on how we evolve the programme. It's certainly, I think, really useful as well sometimes to dig below the surface of kind of hard data to get that more kind of personal element. So one of the things we noted with the programme was we examined the two populations of line managers where managers had that training or where they hadn't to see what we could observe about them. And what we found was that the kind of return to work time was shorter in the trained population, which was great to hear. But I think it's that getting under the skin of the why then has been something we've been able to do through the more kind of qualitative approach. So what managers are telling us is that, and indeed colleagues, it's that thing of the experience they have. So early intervention, colleagues are noticing and talking to them, so they're getting the help they need quicker. They are having a really supported journey while they're out of work as well. So I think managers are learning to be more comfortable with having conversations, so therefore they're keeping in contact really well and building that kind of support. And equally, the return to work has been smoother for colleagues. So we've looked at how we can take that and kind of escalate it, I guess, and get that going more broadly, not just from our line manager programme, but maybe through some of our other initiatives. What can we do with managers quicker to get them in that space?
Great, yeah. So coming back to you, Claire, we've heard quite a lot about the importance of hard metrics around this and about balancing it with the qualitative piece. I know that you've encountered a few challenges and a few unreliable or what will appear to be inconsistent metrics. Can you tell us about how you might have addressed that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess a couple of different challenges, talking about ROI and sort of VOI as well. For us, actually, in the UK, we've got a great HR team who measure all the sickness absence data. But actually, when you look further beyond borders, you've got a large number of countries, different numbers of people in different countries. Actually, having a consistent hard data measure across those countries is really challenging. So actually, value on investment becomes a bit more of an important measure. And then, so from that perspective, we're looking more at engagement. We have an internal tool like you do in terms of social media, and that's really good for looking at engagement and how many people are, reading posts, liking things and that, and you can start to kind of signpost and look at the things that people are valuing from that. So I think that's one of the things. And I guess on a real kind of, simple, actual hard data measurement perspective, sickness absence data is significantly, it's generally really, really hard for people to measure, and it's difficult to have, practices in place. And, we have periods throughout the year where we'll do sort of communication programs and try and encourage employees to log their short-term sickness. So, things like coughs, colds, flus and things like that. And we go through phases where it looks like we've got sort of an epidemic of it, but actually it's just because we've had a communications plan around it. So you can't really use that data because it just doesn't really mean that much to you. So yeah, there are some, quirky challenges, and there will be with all different things. When we do our health checks twice a year, if we go to different offices and we go to a younger office, then that might skew the data. So it's difficult to objectively compare it to different years before. But I think you just have to keep those things in mind and add into it the sort of the people element of it as well.
Great. One final question for the panel before we move on to our questions here. So Pip, I know you've had some interesting results. Anything that you'd particularly highlight?
Yeah, so I think we've had some great results from the mental health programme. We've seen our employee engagement increase by 4%. Specifically, we've seen the engagement increase by 11% around the question around the mental health wellbeing within the workplace. We've also seen a reduction of 20,000 sickness absence days in the period of the year after we launched our mental health programme. And the usage of our employee assistance helpline has quadrupled, so much to the provider's delight. But, so we've had some great results from the programme.
That's brilliant, thank you. So I've got a few questions coming up here from the audience. I think the first one is, and we've already referred to it a little bit here, but should we avoid the term return on investment on mental well-being and instead instill a culture where leaders' language shows that they're invested in people?
I think you need both, because in order to change the trajectory, you need the right language at every level. Return on investment is what our boards respond to, and it's what shareholders want to see. So this is just about being a bit more creative in how we package the information so it meets everyone's needs, whether you're talking employee to employee or line manager to employee, but also in the boardroom. I think it's critical.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'd say right at the start of that journey, your ROI is what you take to the executive board. Mm-hmm. But actually what we found was when we started hearing the stories coming through, they are less minded just to focus on ROI because they've heard someone's story or heard someone has been helped through the programme. So they do start to move away from ROI, but it's still fundamental to getting that continual investment.
And if we do this right, if we do this correctly now, in 3 years' time, that question wouldn't even come up because it would be part of the vernacular in the boardroom.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just reiterate absolutely that I think you have to talk about where you're investing money, why, and what that's doing for an organisation. I think we'll always have to do that, but definitely you get this kind of growing movement that starts to step into the space of they're hearing colleague stories, colleagues are getting excited and enthused about supporting each other, and then that means even more, I think.
Yeah. And it kind of adds to the engagement and almost a bit of an empowerment with your leadership team. When we do sessions we did some sessions or a session in Mental Health Awareness Week where we got a group of our senior leaders just to sit down and talk about their personal approaches to mental well-being. And that was brilliant for the engagement perspective. So actually from their side, they're seeing actually they're part of that ROI that they're delivering on, but employees are seeing that actually their leaders are believing in what they're saying as well. So totally needs both,
Interesting question next for the panel. Do you track the actual hours that your employees work? And if yes, what insights and or changes has this led to?
So it's interesting terminology, isn't it? Track the actual hours that your employees work. In our business, we are evaluated with our clients. We sell our brains, we sell our hours. Yeah. That's what we do. So we measure. I think track is kind of a difficult, perhaps more negative word. So we have to look at the hours that people work and what insights or changes has this led to. I think it's just a baseline understanding of engagement at work. Because you can sit at a desk for 8 hours and be totally,
Yeah, and I think it's about flexible working as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, making sure, and probably the kind of concept of hours works for some different industries and not necessarily for others, but I don't know if you've got a flexible working practice where you're not necessarily, you know, desk bound between 9 and 5, but you can go at 3 o'clock to pick your kids up and play with them for a couple of hours, and then if you do work internationally, log on and do a call later. You're not going to resent logging on to do the call later because you've had the family time. So
It's about the value that you bring to your job, rather than tracking hours.
And I think a great last question, just to finish on, is for each of the panellists, what one key measurement would you recommend implementing? Quite hard.
gosh, one key one, that's a tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it kind of comes as a package.
Yeah.
Well, the hard metrics you were talking about, absenteeism, I suppose it depends where your company is in its journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what your objective is as well.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
if you've got a financial objective or an engagement objective, it's...
And maybe we should be asking our employees what our key measurement should be.
Yeah.
Because after all, we're doing it for, maybe it's attracting talent or retaining talent.
And I agree, and I think what we've seen here today as well is we've got very different businesses, very different programs. It's about understanding what are the outcomes that you want now, and how are you going to measure that, as well as thinking, what's the journey piece that you're on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about measuring that, that organisational attitude. So for me, the one key measure would be anything that measures that shift in change of attitudes, whether it's the employee survey, whether it's doing the surveys pre, during and post line manager training, or any initiatives or campaigns you deliver. For me, that's what's absolutely key.
Yeah, I would agree definitely that if I really had to pick one, I guess I'd want to hear from the colleagues themselves, whether that's through your surveying or through focus groups and listening. But it's the story they tell that probably means most and gives you the richest insights.
Yeah. And the fact that they're willing to tell their stories as well, I suppose, is so big.
It's brilliant. Well, thank you. Hopefully that's kind of whetted everyone's appetite a little bit about the practicalities of measurement, some of the techniques, but also some of the upsides and rewards that actually starting this can give you. I think what we've seen here is, just as you can't generalise mental health, you can't generalise the programme, you can't generalise measurement. I think part of the choice is what's right for you in your organisation, but start with something. Thank you.